Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate that you're joining from all over the Australia and New Zealand region. You're joining on the Emissions Unplugged Cleaning Up Your Value Chain webinar presented by the Big Zero and ERM, and we've got a great special guest from Salesforce with us today as well. I'm Jason Dramanis. I'm joining you from Ghanaland. And on that topic, just want to acknowledge that we meet on lands across Australia and New Zealand, and I want to acknowledge that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples as the traditional owners and custodians and First Nations of Australia, and the Maori as the Tangata Whenua and Treaty of Waitangi partners of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I also want to recognise First Nations people all across the world as the original innovators in sustainability. We've got a few housekeeping items that I wanted to cover off this morning as well as we get started. Some of you may have already seen a post in the Q&A section of the webinar. We are going to have an interactive Q&A session towards the end, following a couple of presentations that we've got from our guests today. And importantly, for everyone that's registered, you'll be posted with a link to a recording that's available for the event. So please share that with others that may not be able to attend. And if you aren't able to attend, we'll make sure that as registrants, you'll get a copy. So as I mentioned, I'm Jason Dramanis. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Big Zero. And today I'm also joined by Alexandra McDonald, who's the Asia Pac lead for sustainability and skills from Salesforce. A great pleasure to have Alex join us, and she'll be providing some really great background on the journey and the initiatives that Salesforce has undertaken in terms of managing Scope 3 emissions. And we're also joined by Charlie Naggs, who's a partner of climate change and energy from ERM, also to provide us with really great insights into setting up the scene for what is Scope 3 emissions, why it's important, and some details about those data collection methods that we've had in terms of some of the key questions that have come through from registering as part of you attending these events. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Charlie, who's going to provide a bit of background in terms of Scope 3 emissions, what it all means, and then we'll hand over to Alex for a bit of a story around the initiatives that Salesforce has undertaken in that process as well. So Charlie, if you're ready to go.
Thank you very much, Jason. Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. So yeah, very pleased to be with you this morning. I think we've got a pretty diverse group of people on the call. I'm sure some of you have some carbon accounting experience, but I understand that some may be a little less familiar with carbon accounting fundamentals. So what I thought I'd do to start out with is just to set the scene around Scope 3, to explain what are Scope 3 emissions, talk through some of the key steps on how we report them, and then talk a little bit about what do we do with them once we have reported them. So when we think about an organization's greenhouse gas emissions footprint, the carbon accounting standards, and in particular, I should call out the GHG protocol, which is kind of the international Bible for carbon accounting. They refer to three different scopes of emissions. And so Scope 1 emissions, these are direct emissions that occur as a direct result of activities at your organization's facilities. So, if you have a boiler in your basement and it's burning natural gas, or if you have fleet vehicles and they're burning petrol, you're combusting that gas or that petrol and it's giving off direct emissions of carbon dioxide. Those are considered to be your direct Scope 1 emission sources. Scope 2, these are emissions from purchased electricity for the most part. So even though those emissions technically are occurring at a power station, which, I'm in Melbourne here, so up in the Latrobe Valley for me, or if you're in Sydney, the power station's mostly up in the Hunter Valley. Even though those emissions are occurring at the power station, because there is such a direct connection between your organisation flicking the switch, the electricity switch, and because electricity-related emissions are usually such a material part of an organisation's carbon footprint, they kind of get their own category there. They get Scope 2 all to themselves. So Scope 2 is all about purchased electricity. So then we have Scope 3 emissions. So these are indirect emissions. They don't occur directly at your facilities, but they do occur as a direct result of your business activities. So typically they occur at the facilities of your suppliers or your customers. And an example that I often use there is if we think about air travel, and your organizations are sending people around the country to attend conferences or go to client meetings or whatever it might be, when the jet fuel gets burned, that's Qantas's Scope 1 emission, because it's directly occurring at their as part of their operations, but your organisation would account for your share of that jet fuel burn for those flights that you go on within your Scope 3 emissions. So a little bit more detail on that, the GHG protocol, this is a famous diagram that's on the slide here that comes out of the GHG protocol. They conveniently divide Scope 3 emissions up into these 15 categories for us. And they span, as you can see on the diagram, the upstream and the downstream activities. So the upstream activities, this is really all about your supply chain. So the things that your organizations, the emissions associated with the things that your organization spends money on. So the well-known ones for upstream Scope 3 are things like the waste generated by your organization and the emissions associated with the disposal of that waste, things like business travel, as I just explained, and employee commuting as well. We then have the downstream component. So this, you can think about this as really the customer value chain piece. So emissions associated with the things that your customers buy from you. You know, a lot of this is around the goods and services that your company produces and the emissions that are associated with those when they get used or when they get disposed of. And then it also picks up things like franchises and investments as well. So why do we care about Scope 3 emissions? Well, really because they are significant. We often see Scope 3 emissions accounting for 2/3 or more of an organisation's carbon footprint. It's not uncommon to see Scope 3 emissions greater than 90% of an organisation's total footprint. So they're a material part of an organisation's footprint, and increasingly customers, regulators, investors are expecting the companies and organisations that they work with to account for these Scope 3 emissions. The next slide there, Jason. So just a very quick kind of, you know, how do we go about measuring these emissions? So the first thing we need to do is establish the emissions boundary. Something that people often don't appreciate is that, you know, setting the emissions, just determining what the emissions boundary is for Scope 3 can often be 50% or more of the work of calculating an inventory, because this is where we decide what sources are in and out, and it really sets us up to be able to do all of the remaining tasks in this category. Sorry, in this process. So once we've identified what sources are in and out, we then seek out the best available data. You know, ideally, this would be supplier-specific data. This would be, you know, when we purchase a good or a service, the supplier of that good or service would tell us what the emissions associated with the provision of that good or service are, so that we could integrate that into our carbon inventory. That's kind of the holy grail. The reality is that we are really, in most cases, nowhere near that yet. So what we end up doing for purchased goods and services, for example, is using a lot of things like spend-based data. There's a lot of proxy data that gets used to estimate Scope 3 emissions. And Jason's going to say a little bit more about data in his preso in a little while. So we then need to identify, depending on what data we've been able to collect, we need to identify emissions factors. So how to convert that data into an emissions number. We then perform the emissions calculations using tools like Salesforce's Net Zero Cloud, which I know Alex is going to talk a little bit about. And we then go ahead and report emissions, and different organisations have different reporting requirements for Scope 3. It might be part of your sustainability report. It might be just for internal purposes. One thing I would note, though, is that the ISSB sustainability reporting standards, which were released last week to much fanfare, so these are internationally agreed sustainability reporting standards, now require for the first time that Scopes 1, 2, and 3 get included in sustainability disclosure. So the inclusion of Scope 3 is really significant there. And then the final step is to develop a data management plan. So this goes back to the quality of data from step 2 in the process, making sure that we are, constantly striving to improve data quality, to work our way up the data quality hierarchy. And then finally, I just wanted to, so Jason, just jump ahead. Finally, just want to talk a little bit about, once we've measured our emissions, what do we do? Well, ultimately, we need to reduce Scope 3 emissions. So I talked previously about the supply chain, so the upstream supply chain component of Scope 3 and the downstream customer value chain component of Scope 3. I think when it comes to addressing emissions, it can be convenient also to include a third category, which is I call operational Scope 3 emissions. So these are emissions. Operational emissions are emissions that are closely linked to business operations, where your organisation typically has a higher degree of influence. These are still Scope 3 emissions, but you have a higher degree of influence. So it's things like waste. So even though those waste emissions are happening at a landfill operated by one of your contractors, you have a pretty high degree of influence over the amount of waste that you produce, the separation of that waste, the recycling of that waste, that kind of thing. Similarly, business travel, it's, Qantas's Scope 1 emissions, it's your Scope 3 emissions, but you have a fair bit of influence over how much your people fly, the availability of video conferencing facilities, that sort of thing. So operational emissions are just carve out there. That can be treated really in many ways like typical Scope 1 and 2 emission sources. So in terms of reducing those emissions, it's just about identifying direct opportunities to reduce those emissions and prioritising those and developing action plans to implement them. When it comes to looking at the left-hand side of the chart here, supply chain emissions, often the challenge there is about getting better quality data. So that's kind of the first battle, is really just trying to engage with your suppliers to get better quality data, but then also encouraging your suppliers to set their own decarbonisation ambitions. Because if your suppliers are decarbonising at the same rate that your company wants to decarbonise, then you can kind of bank those emissions reductions from your suppliers to contribute towards your own Scope 3 emissions reduction efforts. And then in terms of the customer piece, so this is all about products and services that you produce. The emissions reduction opportunities there are really around designing products for efficiency or reduced carbon intensity, and working with your customers, partnering with them to help bring new technologies online to reduce emissions associated with product use and disposal and that kind of thing. So that was a lot to cover in a very short period of time, but I'm very happy to get into further detail in the Q&A momentarily. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for that, Charlie. And we really wanted to be able to lay down and set the scene for everyone to understand some of the complexity and the management of Scope 3 emissions, because it's a big part of the topic. And we can see a lot of the questions that have come through prior to this session are based on how do I manage that data and how do I handle that quite complex scene when it comes to the Scope 3 emissions supply chain. What we'll do now is we'll hand over to Alex, who's actually going to talk about some of the practical implications and the initiatives that Salesforce has undertaken in its own sustainability journey as well. So, Alex, if you're ready to take the floor and run with your presentation.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm joining from Gadigal country here in Sydney. So as Jason said in the intro, I'm Alex. I lead our sustainability efforts across the APAC region for Salesforce. Really passionate about the role technology can play in accelerating climate action across all businesses and the economy at large. So with that in mind, what I wanted to do today is share how we approach sustainability at Salesforce, including how we're thinking about Scope 3, particularly in the supplier space. So to start with, as you'll see on the chart here, our corporate sustainability strategy has 3 key focus areas. So accelerating the world to net zero, leading the H positive movement, and energizing the ecopreneur revolution. So today we'll be zooming in on that first net zero pillar. And if we move to the next slide, just to give you a bit of a flavor about what that entails. So to date, we've achieved net zero residual emissions across our full value chain. So that's scopes 1, 2, and 3, are using 100% renewable energy and are proud to deliver a carbon neutral cloud to all of our customers. And we have one of the most ambitious emission reduction goals that I know of out there. So our scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions will follow a 1.5 degree trajectory, which means they'll need to be cut in half by 2030 and reach near zero by 2040. So as Charlie alluded to, like most companies, the majority of our emissions are outside of our operations in the value chain. So that makes things challenging in terms of how you can influence those, which is also then often compounded with the good challenge to have, but of needing to decouple that the business growth trajectory from our emissions profile trajectory. So how do we decouple those two things? If we go to the next slide, a little bit around how we've managed and solved for this to date. So early on in our journey, we knew we needed to bring digital transformation to our own climate action approach. So back in 2018, our emissions data lived in spreadsheets, and information was very siloed across the organization. And being a tech company, we need, we can do better than living in spreadsheets. And we needed a solution quickly to be able to track, analyze, and report on our environmental footprint with reliable and investor grade ready data. So naturally, we turned to our own platform to look at how we could speed up our carbon accounting process, and spun up what is now known as Net Zero Cloud, but was originally an internal tool, or still remains an internal tool, that sped up our process from 6 months to 6 weeks, and really catalyzed our own success to reach net zero residual emissions. And then 2 years down the track, we then made it generally available to help our customers and partners along their own decarbonisation journeys. So today, Net Zero Clouds helps organisations across all industries and sectors to efficiently manage their sustainability data, and importantly, automate parts like the supplier emissions tracking and forecasting, and ultimately reduce business risk and open up new opportunities. So if we jump to the next slide, as we've talked about, the majority of our climate impact lies in our supply chain. In fact, last year, our supply chain emissions were nearly 4 times our operational emissions, which means, the vast majority is outside of our direct control. So for us to be successful in achieving our net zero commitments, we need to ensure that our suppliers are making progress too. So next slide, please. And so a couple of years ago, back in 2019 now, we made a commitment that by the end of 2024, the suppliers that represent 60% of those supply chain emissions would have their own science-based targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if we jump to the next slide, what we've done to support suppliers along that journey is we're implementing a supplier sustainability program that is really designed to mobilize suppliers to take action on climate change. So we call that program, or part of that program is the supplier exhibit, which is a standard set of climate related provisions that we ask suppliers to agree to as part of their contract with Salesforce. And as of last fiscal year, 26% of our spend under management was with suppliers that have signed on to the sustainability exhibit, and we see that number continue to grow. I think what else is worth mentioning is that in addition to setting science-based targets and providing a third-party ESG or environmental and social governance scorecard, the exhibit also requires suppliers to quantify and disclose the emissions that arise from the products or services delivered under the contract, and to compensate for them with high quality carbon credits. So those two features are especially important to meeting our net zero commitments. And what makes the exhibit quite innovative is the climate positive remedy provision. So if a supplier is unable to meet the agreed terms, the climate positive remedy obligates the supplier to fund an activity that removes or avoids emissions in the atmosphere, such as a renewable energy project, for example. So this way, if things fall short, a more positive outcome is achieved from the planet for the planet than business as usual. Finally, I'll just say here, I think the other thing that's top of mind for us is that we recognize suppliers know their business is the best. So we've designed the exhibit to be flexible enough to adapt to the unique circumstances of each supplier through negotiation, whilst also maintaining the integrity of what we're trying to do. So there's a bit of a flavour about how we're approaching things, and I will hand over to Jason now.
Thanks, Alex. No, I really appreciate that. And there's some great insights as a globally operating organisation like Salesforce, how you've actually put in place a lot of those initiatives, but also give us some ideas around some insights for how to actually systemise that and approach that from a data lens as well. So all three organizations, the Big Zero, ERM, and Salesforce, we're seeing some common trends in the market when we're talking to our customers. And we wanted to share some of the typical barriers and how we're actually tackling those from a technology lens perspective as well. And hopefully use this to inform both the Q&A session, but what you can take back from this webinar to help achieve better Scope 3 management of data, and also, more importantly, the goals and the objectives that you're looking to achieve from a sustainability lens. So the first barrier is often the challenge around insights. When we look at handling particularly Scope 3 emissions information, how do you capture and collect that information from suppliers becomes a common challenge. So putting in place systems and components is really important, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It's obviously constantly a manually intensive process as well, because when you're dealing with data points from suppliers, it comes in many different formats. It's often quite complex. Charlie mentioned before the GHG protocol and the order and structure around managing Scope 3 emissions, and even using that from a disclosures perspective and a conversation piece with inside your organisation. The data isn't structured like that when you're talking to suppliers, so handling that challenge is also important. The third point here is it's often hard to estimate those emissions data points. So how do you, when you're purchasing a product or a service, or engaging with a supplier, or even engaging with a customer in your value chain, estimate those emissions that are occurring? That's obviously a complex process and a common theme that we see amongst our customers. The fourth point is around disclosures. So an important part of the announcement around ISSB and the standards that came out recently was there's international standards now which are being adopted regionally as well by the New Zealand Accounting Standards Board and also the Australian Accounting Standards Board, around what those disclosures mean for organisations and who do they apply to. And if you are making those disclosures, how do you do that in a way that's both transparent but in conformance with those standards? Because there are legal implications, there's investor implications, and often those disclosures get read by customers as well, so there can be revenue implications on that side of the value chain also. And then the fifth point is around stakeholder awareness. It's a common theme amongst the challenge that we see around sustainability, that engaging with stakeholders is a really critical outcome as well. So how do we solve this, right? There's a lot of different challenges, but to give you some pointers around, particularly on the first point around technology, there are technology points that really thrive with this kind of complexity. Automation tools are available. That's an obvious point. Handling some of those manual processes, particularly if they're structured and they follow a particular flow, automation can be really helpful, but so can AI and analytics. AI is a great tool to use in terms of its cognitive ability. So its ability to actually grab data that exists in what is often unstructured language. It might be in unstructured data points as well, and using that to actually facilitate the engagement of a structure around that data as well, and getting that into your systems. And then obviously analytics and coupling that with AI is really important. So here at the Big Zero, we've got some great experience, and we've actually developed some products to help our customers along those lines as well. And Salesforce in the platform has got some great generative AI and other AI technologies that are available as well. Then also the other next point is to treat the problem like it's an enterprise IT problem. So sustainability, if we're thinking about it from a supply chain perspective and couple that with your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, there's impacts in your operations, there's impacts to your suppliers, there's conversations to be had with your finance team, and often they're key inputs to having that sustainability conversation across an organisation. So if we're looking at this in the long term, is consider it an enterprise IT outcome that you're trying to achieve. But of course, this is often the first time organisations are doing this. So we've got a bit of a journey map on the next slide that I'll show that talks about how to get there. The next is the sustainability systems implementation. So we've talked about the enterprise scale of the challenge, but how do we also systemize that and engage with the various stakeholders? And that's not only stakeholders inside your organisation, but also stakeholders that exist in your customer base, in your supply chain, conversations with investors, particularly if you've got an investor relation team. So making sure that the systems are designed around those stakeholder engagement communications is really important. And then the fourth point is ensuring that those estimates are useful and transparent. So often the challenge with estimates is we're trying to get to a really accurate level of data points. So that often what we see is organisations trying to really achieve absolute accuracy in their emissions. I guess as a flavour and a point to make here is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. If you can get to estimates that are disclosed in their calculations and are built around assumptions, and it's faster to have that engagement, that's often a better perspective to be considering in terms of conversations with those various stakeholders that I mentioned before. And then the final point is consider the data, but also with the dialogue that goes with it. So the qualitative information is just as critical when we're considering both the data, the systems, and the information that we need to have in terms of those conversations with those stakeholders. And that really goes to a lot of the previous points that I made earlier around those disclosures, responsibilities, and engaging with stakeholders. So this is a diagram that the Big Zero has developed really to help articulate the journey that organisations are on, particularly if you're coming from a point of never having done this before from a systems-based perspective. And I understand that we've got different organisations joining us and they'll be at different perspectives of this journey. The first part of the journey is really to start considering, where do you want to be? That's when we start to consider things like, what is your materiality? So what's material to your business that you want to consider is part of that sustainability journey that you want to undertake? And then from there, what are the aspirations and goals that you're looking to achieve as an organisation? So that's when those targets and metrics come into play. And once you've set that in play, that's a really good starting point to have a conversation around the systems and the data framework that needs to be developed to support those, because those two things are really coupled. If you've got goals and achievements that you're trying to get to, you need to understand how the organisation's actually going to pivot. How are you going to design the operations of the organisation around that to achieve those outcomes? And that goes right across your value chain. The next great phase or maturity model that we move into is really determining the process and learning from those insights. So once we get a system in place, making sure you've got that measurement and reporting happening. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So making sure that you're focusing on those outcomes and consider where the measurement and reporting and management is occurring across the organisation. Is it in the operations team? Is it with the procurement team that you need to have those conversations? And where does that integrate with things like policy, and perhaps even consider your sustainability policy improvement and its impact on some of those systems that need to be informed and designed around those broader policies as an enterprise? And then the third phase that we see is when an organisation's really starting to gain momentum in the sustainability journey is engagement with external stakeholders, when you're starting to really get deep in terms of the governance, and those qualitative disclosures become something really important that your organisation focuses on. So this is where the deep collaboration starts to happen. You've collected all the data points, you've started to design the policy and operations of your business, and you're ready to start having those really deep conversations with the stakeholder groups, the investors, the customers, your supply chain, and also the employees within your organisation, right? So what is the data actually telling them that's going to be meaningful from a sustainability initiative perspective? So that's the final point. We are going to quickly move to Q&A in a moment, but there's a couple of things that I just wanted to move through and explain. There's a really great podcast, and it's not for today's topic, on nature-based disclosures. And there's some interrelations in terms of nature-based impact that organisations have as it relates to things like Scope 3 emissions. Obviously, our Scope 3 and our value chain emissions, in fact, their emissions anywhere inside our organisation, do have impacts on the planetary systems. But nature-based disclosures and the whole process of that is actually becoming even more important. And there's developing standards that are coming out from TNFD, and also there's expectations that the ISSB might release some further standards as well on that particular topic. So there's a link here. It's really simple to get access to this podcast, though. If you just Google ERM Sustainable Connections podcast, and then you can access that on any of the podcast platforms that you choose. And just on this slide here as well, follow us on the channels, because we're really interested to engage with you as organisations. You'll get some really good insights from us as we continue our journey and as we continue to develop solutions for our customers as well. So with that, I'll drop back from the slides, and we've got some Q&As coming in as well. But I think one of the overriding themes is that we've had a lot of questions coming in. We gave participants the opportunity to ask us some questions prior to this session. And there's a lot of questions that are around those data elements and the data synthesis, and how do you get data into systems as well. I might ask Alex and Charlie to just come on screen again, because there's really, I think that between the three of us, a good conversation to be had around some of those data elements and how they need to be considered in terms of an organisational context. Charlie, I know that there's a lot of conversations that you have, particularly around materiality assessment as it relates to things like Scope 3 emissions, and perhaps you've got some comments to make on there.
Well, so yeah, one of the challenges with Scope 3 is I mentioned before that the boundary setting piece is a critical aspect of it, and a critical part of the boundary setting piece is what we call the relevance tests. So this is how we decide what's in and what's out. And the relevance tests are things like, is an emission source large compared to other sources? Is it something that the organisation has a lot of influence over? Is it something that the organisation's stakeholders would expect to see included in the emissions inventory? And I mean, you can maybe start to see from those questions that they can be quite subjective, right? So, if we're including or excluding a Scope 3 emission source based on these relevance tests, and we're asking ourselves, okay, would a stakeholder expect us to include, emissions associated with the embodied emissions in our capital goods, in our emissions inventory? How do you determine that? There's not a lot of guidance about how you actually make that decision about whether an organisation, whether a stakeholder would care enough for them to want you to include that. So we need to use, and similarly, there's this relevance test around materiality. So around, how significant is the emission source in the context of your broader Scope 1, 2, and 3 inventory. And there's not a lot of guidance about what they mean by materiality. So it's actually up to the company to decide for themselves what they think, how they define significant in that context. And so I know, I was having a look through the questions that came through prior to the session. And a lot of them are around, like, where do we draw the line between what's in and what's out in respect of Scope 3? And it is challenging because you have these, there is an inherent subjectivity in the relevance test, which is basically what determines your boundary. So, I mean, just really quickly on that, the way that we try to address that is to bring a little bit of structure and a little bit more detail, I suppose, into those relevance tests. So, for example, when we're looking at, is this something that a stakeholder would expect us to report, there are kind of proxies we can use there. We can say, is this something that your peers typically report on? Because if your peers report on it, then that indicates that there's some level of stakeholder expectation that it gets reported. Is it something that your key stakeholders, whether they are regulators or investors or customers, that you hear them talking about through the media or through guidance documents that get put out, or advocacy pieces, or whatever it might be? In terms of the materiality piece, can we put some reasonably accepted percentages in there to kind of determine what does significant look like? What does material emission source look like? And so, we sort of come up with somewhere in the order of 5% being, anywhere between 1% and 5%, depending on the client, being considered, significant in that context. So it is a challenge, and it feeds into that broader complexity around boundary setting.
Thanks, Charlie. And even in the context of that collaboration, you've alluded there to some of those discussions and discourse that happens with, say, investors and in investor relations. A lot of the materiality and subjects can come about from those conversations that you have with investors. And one of the wonderful things about Salesforce is it's a great platform for collaboration. It's its heritage. It's a CRM. Alex, there's a question that's come through as well about feedback on the engagement that you have across the Australia and New Zealand region. Has there been any conversations or insights that you've gained in terms of the way that Salesforce engages with stakeholders, and some overriding themes around how you support those initiatives and those conversations with those broader stakeholder groups?
Yeah, sure. And actually, I was just going to sort of build on that first question, and then if I can come to the second question, I was just sort of going to bring it to life a little bit around how we categorize and think about our value chain emissions. So we've sort of organized our value chain emissions into 4 categories. So that we feel reflect our business operations. So we categorize in terms of infrastructure, supplier enablement, which I talked quite a bit about before, business travel, and then our global campuses or real estate footprint. So we've found that kind of categorization maximizes the efficiency of our emissions reduction work on that path to a collective 50% reduction by fiscal year 31. So, and then I think just the final point I'll make on that is we talked a lot about supplier enablement, but we're increasingly looking at infrastructure and looking at what building sustainable products means to our customers. So thinking about, last year we brought out an internal sustainability guide for Salesforce technology. So a collection of best practices that drive sustainability in Salesforce products and beyond across sort of design, architecture, development, and operations. So yeah, how do we bring that piece into the equation as well? So moving on to the question around stakeholders, I think the and some of the conversations at the APAC level, I think one of the things that probably most top of mind for me is around engagement with the public sector, and really how do those public-private sector models or when you talk about collaboration and stakeholder management, really we want private and public sector working together to progress enabling policy and really create that change at a systems level. Because if we can transform at a systems level, then that then benefits everybody's ability to decarbonize across the board. So I think in terms of reflections, a lot of productivity, like productive conversations into industry, but also then cross sector that's really seeing an acceleration of action at that systemic level would be probably one key observation.
And the next question we've got coming
Jason,
through. Sorry, Charlie,
do you mind if I just jump? Alex, I just want to build on that. I've actually got a question. I want to build on that line of questioning for you, because I think it's really interesting. There's a lot of challenges at the moment around addressing Scope 3. Like, we're starting to get a much better handle than we had 5 years ago on how to measure Scope 3. But now the conversation is very quickly turning to what do we do about it, and supplier engagement is usually the first thing that comes to people's minds. How do we get our suppliers onto this journey? How do we get better data from them? How do we, and what you talked about in your preso is that's some of the stuff that's like, that's the ideal situation. If you can build sustainability requirements into supplier contracts, if you can, get your suppliers onto a decarbonisation journey that matches yours, then you're in sync, and therefore you're achieving your own target trajectory. So yeah, I just really wanted to, and I saw a comment come through in the chat about it. Like, how much of a struggle has it been to get suppliers on board with that? Do you get a lot of pushback when you go and say to them, listen, we want you to sign up to these sustainability related contracts? Is there a price premium associated?
Yeah, look, not a lot of pushback. I think what's critical is we need to have the support there for suppliers. So it's not necessarily just like, here, over to you, this is what we expect, but it's having that enabling support program for those top emitting suppliers as well, and then focusing on where we can have the most influence in terms of those top emitters, and then learning from that cohort, and then sort of evolving and recognizing how we might need to tailor support for a large supplier versus an SME supplier, for example. So there needs to be quite a lot of flexibility in the approach. I don't think, not really a lot of pushback. I think there's a lot of maturity and recognition around everyone needs to do this. Let's get on with the job. A lot of appreciation for support in terms of, I guess us as a business are fortunate to have the resources and ability to be able to progress this work, but then what's then our responsibility to share back those learnings and help others along the journey. So I think there's certainly a maturity of people being like, yep, we need to do this, and then an appreciation for that support along the journey. So I think that's critical, and then being adaptive, that like one approach doesn't fit all organizations, so being responsive and adaptive to that is also quite key.
There's also another question, and thanks, Charlie. That's really great insights there as well, and from yourself, Alex, about certifications. There's a particular question here around climate active, but there's also Toitu certifications in New Zealand as an example. Alex, you mentioned SBTI before, and there's a number of initiatives and various other reporting frameworks that exist both internationally and regionally, and some of those are voluntary schemes like the Toitu scheme and the climate active scheme in Australia. Really, there's, I guess, a lot of insights we can provide, and I'm wondering whether you've got some thoughts on building those certification programs into the work that organisations do around sustainability, because I feel like there's almost a conversation to be had around, well, if you've got a sustainability journey and part of that is the certification program, it's almost a process that you might build into the systems-based thinking and the types of data that you're probably already going to be having conversations similar to the supply chain actors in. So if you've got any thoughts, Charlie or Alex, on that.
Yeah, I mean, we do a fair bit of work with clients seeking certification under Climate Active here in Australia. There's been a massive surge in popularity in that scheme over the last 5 years. Although I think, to be honest, I think it's probably eased off a little bit in the last few years as a few interesting things happened. Firstly, the greenwashing agenda in Australia has become really prominent, and so organisations are just being very careful about the big, bold public pronouncements that they make. And Climate Active is really all about that big, bold public carbon neutral pronouncement that companies can make. I think there's also, perhaps relatedly, been a lot of scrutiny over carbon offsets of late. People on the call, I'm sure, have seen newspaper articles. Projects in South America, in Africa, here in Australia are all getting scrutinised very carefully about, are they actually delivering the carbon sequestration or the avoided emissions that they claim to that they claim to be. And because Climate Active is a carbon offsetting scheme, essentially, I think it's resulted in a little bit of tentativeness, maybe, from people who might have been considering Climate Active. I guess from a Scope 3 perspective, it's been really heartening to see. So if you look at a Climate Active, you can look at a public disclosure summary, right, for Climate Active companies online. You can go and look them up, going back to the beginning of the scheme back in 2010 or thereabouts. And if you look at the progression of, and it's always been mandatory to report Scopes 1, 2, and 3, but if you look at those Scope 3 inventories from 10 years ago, it'll be a little bit of air travel, a bit of waste, and maybe some paper consumption. For some reason, paper consumption was this thing that everyone really felt like they had to report in Scope 3, even though it's utterly trivial. Literally, that would be those three sources. That's your Scope 3 inventory, and you can track the progress over time to now we're at a point where people are including, there'll be 30 different Scope 3 sources across those 15 categories that I mentioned: embodied emissions in purchased goods and services, and employee commuting, and the use of the sold product, which is a really interesting one. If you sell a toaster, then you need to start accounting for the electricity use when people make their toast in the morning, within your Scope 3 inventory. So I guess that's a bit of an observation, is that those schemes have done a good job to get people thinking more ambitiously and expanding their Scope 3 inventories to what is a much more representative boundary over time.
And that toaster scenario, Charlie, is really interesting, right? Because if you're selling a toaster, how do you know how many pieces of toast that toaster's going to be making before it ends up in the waste stream somewhere, and probably even accounting for that as part of your emissions profile as well. Alex, I don't know if you've got any other comments to make as well in relation, particularly to Salesforce's initiative. You've gone really all in terms of SBTI commitment, the 1.5 degree target being the commitment that Salesforce is making. Just maybe some insights into some of the activities at Salesforce, and in particular as it relates to your role. How are you collecting that data to make sure that those initiatives are tracked, and what does that actually look like as an organisation?
Yeah, so I think on the scheme question, I think for us, it's, as a global business in lots of different markets, we're keen on harmonisation of standards and that sort of thing. I think that the schemes definitely have their place, and the local relevance of those. But then from a sort of what do we focus on, really going for that internationally harmonized program like SBT program is what we're chasing. And I think Charlie touched on then at a local level looking at what the ACCC and ASIC are doing around greenwashing, and I think that's all it's all sort of a trend in the right direction in terms of an increased desire for transparency and then harmonization along the journey. So I feel like over time we'll probably see that consolidate a little bit in that space, and certainly the tools that we offer in Net Zero Cloud have the ability to adapt to the different frameworks, whichever one's organizations choose are best for them. And then I was just sort of going to comment off the back of another piece that Charlie alluded to around the sort of carbon offset integrity and the conversations around that. And I think our point of view is we definitely need to prioritize emissions reduction as a primary objective, then clean energy, then carbon credits last, but not later. So we sort of talk about it internally as an all of the above moment, and needing to deploy sort of every solution that we have at our fingertips. So meaning, that emissions reductions first, then clean energy, then carbon credits. So whilst we avoid and reduce emissions as quickly as possible, and then match all the energy we use with clean and renewable energy, we also then look to carbon credits as a way to reach that net zero residual emissions every year from here on out. I think that the key piece in that is looking at, the supply and the integrity. How can we increase supply of those really high integrity credits as well to deliver impact to different communities out there. So yeah, just wanted to sort of comment on that piece as well.
And we've got a really great breadth of questions coming through from the audience as well. I might wind back to the situation where an organisation's really starting its journey. And we've got a question here. It's asking about what would you suggest to organisations who don't know where to start on their sustainability journey. And that's really important because those organisations may exist in your supply chain as well. So even if you take a forward-leaning view, it's making sure that we recognise that not all of the individuals that make up our supply chain, which may be critical elements for a business, are on the same pathway or at least at the same level of maturity in terms of where they've made their commitments. We often, I spoke about that in my slides, the importance of setting up metrics, targets, goals, and really those aspirations that your organisation is looking to achieve. I wonder if either of you got a perspective on an organisation. We've all been there with our organisations respectively as well. We've had to start this journey. So what would you give in terms of recommendations or pointers to someone who's in a sustainability role or they're in a role where they're just passionate about it? What conversations should they be having and who should they be having those conversations with?
I can happy for you to go first, Alex, or I can take it.
I was just going to say it's I guess it depends on the organisation and the role that someone finds themselves in. I think if it's if there is already sort of leadership commitment around a specific if there's an ambition out there already, that can be a different type of conversation around just needing to get visibility over what your footprint is, so then you can then be informed about how then you might want to set particular targets and then design the roadmap to how you're going to achieve those, versus in the conversation's a bit different if you need to actually get sustainability on the agenda in the first place and get that buy-in. So I think if I was talking to the latter scenario there around like how do you increase the importance or elevate the importance of climate action on the agenda of your business, I think for me personally, it's been the most useful thing. I mean, I've been quite fortunate to work in organizations who have had that top-down leadership, but increasingly in my work, what's been the most helpful thing is always presenting decisions and business cases in the sort of commercial terms, and then always trying to make the business case for sustainability. So is it less, with emissions reduction comes less cost and cost savings? Is there more trust with different stakeholders, be it legislators, be it your customers, be it your own employees? So what's the upside of that trust? How does that then translate to greater business growth? How does that translate to less churn of employees? And then ultimately, how does that mitigate risk in the long term, but also medium term? So always trying to then link it back to that business case, rather than going on the moral case, which a lot of people understand from a heart perspective. But then how do you elevate that to a head perspective, and really make that sound business case? That's probably what I'd say has been most fruitful for me in my career, just keeping that top of mind when you're trying to sort of accelerate some of the conversations and get buy-in with internal stakeholders.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think there is a strong commercial case to be made for sustainability. You just need to find it in some cases. So absolutely agree with that. I think in terms of practical things that you can do if you're starting out on this journey, the first if clients come to us and they say, we know sustainability is important, we're not sure where to start, we usually say, well, the first thing you should do is a materiality assessment. So materiality assessment is something that looks at the broader sustainability agenda, so everything from greenhouse gases to community investment, to license to operate, to human rights, to supply chain issues and everything in between. And it's quite a structured process. There are standards for conducting materiality assessment that basically lets you see, of that whole universe of sustainability issues that are out there, which are the ones that are most important to our organization. And so that really gives you the starting point to then set a strategy, because once you know the issues that are important, you can't do everything, right? You shouldn't try to do everything. You should try to find those sustainability issues that are most material, most salient for your organization, and a materiality assessment allows you to do that, and therefore, then becomes a foundation for developing a strategy. So that's one thing. In the carbon space, the first thing you should do is to measure your carbon footprint. So having a look at things like the GHG protocol, which is, it's a pretty weighty old tome. I think it's a few hundred pages, but there are a lot of supporting guidance in there to help you look, even if you're not doing a full 100% standards aligned carbon inventory in the first instance, just getting that kind of hotspot analysis of where your emissions are is a great starting point, because that then allows you to understand where the big ticket items are to focus your emissions reduction activities.
Yeah, and an important part there is also to get that expertise into the door as well, so that you're having the right conversations
Naturally
with those stakeholders too, right? So a bit of a plug for ERM there. But I think the important part that we're seeing in a lot of the conversations that we have as well is engaging with those stakeholders, really just using what are the typical stakeholder engagement techniques, making sure that you understand where individuals and groups might be coming from. And also how to engage with them to make them feel compelled to continue that sustainability journey as well. That's an important aspect of it, because getting that journey started is an organisation-wide challenge for many that are in these individual roles. And so understanding who are the individuals that are really important to getting on board for that kind of initiative. We've got another interesting question here, really around small and medium businesses, and it was directed at Alex, but I might sort of pull it apart a little bit in talking about small to medium enterprise and the challenges around if you've got to do all this work, right? And as an organisation like Salesforce that's well resourced, it's a challenge for you as well. How do we support small to medium enterprise? And one of the conversations we've often had is things like industry representative groups, and there's a lot of bodies out there that can help in that collaboration. So even getting us outside of our usual remit in our day-to-day jobs and working with some of those industry bodies can be an important aspect of engaging as well. So small to medium enterprise is often well represented. You may be part of your own particular industry body. You may be part of a particular group that's focused on the types of services that you're offering. So one of those things not to forget about there when it comes to small to medium enterprise is to seek out support outside of your organisation as well and be part of that program. Alex, Charlie, I don't know if you've got any other thoughts on some of the engagements with industry bodies as well yourselves.
No, that was going to be my main call out, as I know the industry bodies we're involved in have that very top of mind around, how do we then share learnings and then share support across the board. So no, nothing really to add there, but that was the first thing that came to mind for me also.
And Charlie, I think we've got a question. It's more of a practical implication question for you. Someone's asked about the input-output method, which is a particular technique when using calculators to derive emissions from things like your Scope 3 supply chain. The question here is about what do those methods look like, and particularly how does it account for things like inflation? And maybe, Charlie, you could go through a bit of a background on spend-based versus volumetric and then supplier-derived, and to give us insights into the different types of ways of calculating and pulling apart the metrics to get to an emissions profile in the supply chain. It's a big topic too, because we could be here for a while. So the best is you can summarise.
I'll try and be very quick. So look, the holy grail in terms of, I guess we're specifically talking here about categories 1 and 2 in Scope 3, which is purchase goods and services and capital goods. So these are what your organisation buys. The holy grail there is, as I said before, that your supplier. So if you're buying a forklift, your supplier of that forklift would tell you what the embodied emissions are. So how many emissions did it take to manufacture that forklift, from the extraction of the resources, the steel and the aluminium and whatever out of the ground, through to the delivery of that forklift at your gate? What were the emissions? And you could then plug that number into your emissions inventory and say a forklift is equal to 638 tonnes. That goes into our inventory. The reality is we're nowhere near that yet in most cases. So we then have to kind of work our way down the data, the hierarchy. So the next thing we would do is we would say, if we're buying that forklift from Toyota, how many forklifts did we buy? You know, and if how many forklifts did we buy, and can we find an emissions factor somewhere out there in the universe from someone that says a forklift is equal to 538 tons or however many tons it is, and plug that into our inventory? If we can't do that, what we might be able to do is look at Toyota and say, we know that Toyota globally has, 10 million tons of CO2 emissions, and they make X billion dollars of revenue, and therefore the carbon intensity of Toyota is X tons per $1 million revenue, and we spent, $1 million on forklifts, and therefore we can kind of take a share of Toyota's emissions. And then, so we're kind of working our way down the data hierarchy. Pretty much at the bottom of that hierarchy, we get to the spend-based methods, which are being mentioned here in the question, which is where we say we spent, $10 million on Toyota. There is an emissions factor somewhere out there in the universe that says, vehicle manufacture, it results in emissions of X tons per $1 million of spend. And then we can just kind of calculate a rough estimate of what the emissions are there. So that's what we're referring to here by spend-based data and input-output factors. Those input-output factors come from a myriad of different places. There's academic studies, there's big databases coming out of the US and the UK in particular. And universities often have their own databases of input-output factors. But it's a very good point that's raised here, because those input-output factors, if it's a US database, firstly, often they're quite old, so inflation becomes a factor. So if the emissions factors were calculated in 2016, then $1 million of spend in 2016 is a very different thing to $1 million of spend today because of the inflation effect. And also the other thing to consider is the exchange rate, because those US studies will be in US dollars and we need to convert them back to Australian dollars. So very, very long-winded answer to reach a very simple question, but you should absolutely account for inflation and exchange rate when applying input-output factors, although noting that those input-output factors are inherently highly uncertain in the first place, and that we should always be striving to work our way up that data hierarchy.
And it becomes an interesting topic too when you're using spend-based metrics, because Alex, you talked about it in terms of the targets that Salesforce is looking to achieve. Often it can be useful as a baseline, or at least a calculator while you don't have the right information available. But one of the challenges with spend-based is it would just tell you that the more that you spend, the more that your emissions go up, which may not be the case, particularly as many of your suppliers and even in your value chain on the customer end are actually looking to decarbonize themselves. So this is where those emission factors, they actually get updated typically annually. So making sure that you're using the right period of time against those emissions factors and really come out with the right calculations that are going to make sense for the aspirations that you're looking to achieve, not only as your organisation, but within your supply chain as well. Look, we are coming up to the final few minutes of the session, and really paying respect to our attendees who have hung on and have been listening to us, and we've had some really great questions coming through. Alex, Charlie, if you've got any other final points before we wrap up, and then we might close things out.
No, just a big thank you for people for taking the time out for an hour. I sort of thought like, oh, scope 3, it's quite niche, well, we have the turnout, but I think it's really, it shows the really the relevancy of the content, and just, I guess we've talked a lot about the challenges as well. It shows kind of, I guess, commonality in that, the challenge around how we manage it, but also then the desire to get on top of it, and the desire to have impact at that space, just given how large the shared kind of challenges across all of our common value chains as businesses. So really just encouraging to see the appetite, I think, is my key reflection. And yeah, just a big thank you to people for taking the time out to join us today.
Yeah, and just building on that, I think that appetite is only going to grow. I think we've already seen the trajectory of Scope 3 sort of increase in terms of the amount of scrutiny it gets, the level of expectation around what gets included in the Scope 3 inventory. Things like ISSB and the inclusion of now if you want to align with that standard, you must now include Scope 3 emissions in your disclosures. That's only going to put added pressure on the rigor and robustness of Scope 3, and the importance of having good measurement platforms to be able to calculate Scope 3 emissions. Thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah, no, thanks, Charlie. And just one final wrap up. I just want to say a huge thanks to Alex and Charlie. There's a lot of preparation that goes behind the scenes in getting these sessions up and running. I just want to thank you for your time. Importantly, thank you for our audience as well, and a huge thank you for attending. We've had a great turnout today. We know that there may be lots of questions that you've got, so as we hinted at before, stay connected up with us on the socials. We've all got our contact points as organisations as well. Huge thank you to ERM and Salesforce as partners with the Big Zero. And with that concludes our webinar. Thank you, everyone.